Welcome to the LeaderCast podcast, a weekly deep dive into the stories that transformed our guests into leaders worth following. I'm your host, Joe Boyd. If you've been enjoying the podcast, thank you so much for being a listener. One simple thing you can do to help us out is give a review wherever you listen. Today's guest is Eddie Ndopu. He is a United Nations Global Disability Advocate, and he has been on our LeaderCast main stage recently for our Human Intelligence program. You're going to love this talk that I have with Eddie. He is one of the strongest people that I've ever met in my life, but at one point he's going to tell us what is even more important than strength and optimism in his life. You're going to want to hear that. Eddie Ndopu, welcome to the LeaderCast podcast. It is so exciting to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I am so thrilled to be in conversation with you. Thank you for having me.
I love it. It's so we record these podcasts 4 to 6 weeks before they come out, but we were just together last week at our event, and you killed it. You were awesome on our main stage. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure. And there's such a different energy and vibe about LeaderCast. I mean, kudos to bringing together such a multidisciplinary group of people. It truly was very special. I'd say certainly one of my top events, keynotes that I've done in a while. So thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. And you're people will see here in the next few minutes, but you're such a sweet guy and so easy to talk to and then communicate on stage. So we were thrilled to have you, and now you're officially part of the LeaderCast community. So I got my fangs in you, like I'm not letting go. So you're part of us now forever, and thanks for doing that. Hey, I can't imagine anyone in my life that I know whose lived experiences is different than mine, more than you. So and not just concerning your disability, but everything else in your life. Could you please let's just go from the beginning. Could you kind of tell us a little bit of how your life started and what those first few years were like for you growing up in South Africa, right?
Yeah, South Africa.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a really great question. And what I will say is that the odds were stacked against me from the very beginning. I was born in 1990 against the backdrop of political upheaval in South Africa and in Namibia, across Southern Africa. The apartheid regime was sort of clamping down on fundamental freedoms for people of color. And I was really born really at the peak of what was a very tumultuous period in Southern Africa. And I was born to a Namibian father and a South African mom. And I was diagnosed at the age of 2 with a degenerative condition called spinal muscular atrophy, SMA. And essentially what SMA is, it the older I get, the weaker I become. And I was given a prognosis of 5 years old, straight out the gate.
They only thought you would live to be 5, is what you're saying, right?
They only thought that lived to be 5. And I marvel at my life because in so many ways I am a living manifestation of possibility, right? I not only went on to defy the medical establishment and continue to outlive myself, but very early on, through the tenacity of a fearless mom, who became a single parent very early on, she placed all her bets on me and really facilitated that I enter mainstream schooling. So in late 1990s in Namibia, I became one of literally only a handful of disabled children to be enrolled into the mainstream education system, right? And so it was this experiment. Nobody knew if this was going to work. My mom was told constantly that, this is not like, don't you just want to consider institutionalizing this kid, which
Yeah.
was the practice at the time, that the children with disabilities, and to this day that remains the case in so many parts of the world, where disabled kids are made to disappear from public view.
Mm.
And my mom made sure that I had access to every single opportunity that my able-bodied counterparts had. And fast forward, I'm sitting here with you. We're having this conversation, and I have had the most extraordinary things happen to me. And I attribute that to forces beyond myself, really. And I think I'm living proof of what is possible when we invest in people who aren't given opportunity, that it is possible to lead a full, meaningful, productive life.
Well, you're obviously, yeah, a testament to that for sure. I guess since I've only known you for like a couple months now, but I know who the person I met. But I wonder, you seem to be a very optimistic, positive, focused person. Is Was that natural? Did that come from your mom, or was there growing up? Were there stages where you were less optimistic, or was that just kind of the way you've always been?
It's a great question. I do think that my optimism is really a survival strategy in so many
Mhm.
ways. Like I'm not sure I have the luxury not to be optimistic, right? Like I
Gotcha.
actually think that optimism is the fuel that allows me to be able to push through all the white noise around me, right? To be able to sort of say that I need to believe, Joe, that there is more out
Yeah.
there. I have to believe that I am not destined to be the object of ostracization and marginalization. Like that there has to be more to
Yeah.
my life. And so I think I've just been I've been defiant. I think since I was a child, I've always had these huge dreams, these really impossible dreams. I saw myself having a big life as a child, and I would fantasize. I daydream. I imagine my life, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, I'd love to travel the world. I'd love to be an artist. I'd love to be this, an icon, right? I've always had those huge dreams, and that was my escape, I think, from not allowing myself to internalize the voices of exclusion and internalize voices that are not my own.
Yeah. Well, you have become those things. So, when are your earliest memories of realizing that maybe this dream you had could start to become a reality? Where you said you lived an amazing life. What are your earliest memories of thinking that, oh, this is amazing? I'm getting to do this.
Well, I think there was a pivotal moment, and I think it sort of happened around the age of 16. I had applied to this very prestigious leadership academy. I read it in the pages of a magazine, and I was blown away by the vision of the school. And
Yeah.
essentially, it's this boarding school for gifted um, young people from across the African continent, and it's got this bold vision of developing the next generation of leaders. And something inside me said apply. I it wasn't
Mm.
I was okay at school, but I wasn't like a straight A student. I wasn't particularly exceptional, but I knew that I had a story that was worthy of being told,
Yeah.
and I knew that I am in so many ways I'm a vessel for so many young people with disabilities who are just not in the room, right? And so I just, I there was this voice that just said apply.
Yeah.
And I applied and I went through the process, right up until the finalist weekend. And, I had worked so hard and I thought, okay, I'm a shoe in.
Yeah.
And then I got a call saying that I didn't get in. I didn't get accepted because, it was a brand new school, they weren't sure whether they had all of the protocols in place to be able to
Hmm.
support somebody with a profound disability like myself. And they were like, we wish you well, you're phenomenal, but we don't think we can make this work.
Hmm.
And there was another voice inside me that just refused to accept no for an answer,
Yeah.
so I went behind my mom's back and I penned a letter to the founders of the academy, and I sort of very politely, as diplomatically as I knew how, told them that they had made a big mistake
Yeah.
and that I believed in my bones that I was deserving of a place in the inaugural class. And something about my letter must have resonated because I received another call a couple of weeks later, and they were
Yeah.
like, "I think you're right. I think we made a mistake.
Wow.
Congratulations, you've been awarded admission." And that changed the trajectory of my life. I think it wasn't so much as getting into the school as it was me sort of insisting, sort of forcing myself through, that
Yeah.
then kind of opened up this this fearlessness within me, and
Yeah.
I never looked back. I broke the rearview mirror and I didn't look back after that.
Well, that's an impressive story, I have to say. And what strikes me, I guess, is that they could have, I suppose, said you just don't qualify by some other means, but they were honest with you and said it actually is your disability that's holding us back,
Yeah,
which probably a lot of people wouldn't be honest about that in the first place, perhaps.
yeah,
But then I'm sure your life is a series of those moments where uh, you know, I would think it's one thing if they're like, well, your test scores just weren't, you
right,
didn't. We compared you
right,
to everyone else. You're not in, but
right.
this is obviously something that's not your fault and that you've worked toward. Um, is it fair to assume that's been sort of a pattern in your life that there's something in you that has to kind of fight for yourself?
Every day, and I'll share this with you, Joe, and I'll be a little bit provocative and actually say that the more barriers I break down, the more I encounter, right? It's almost
Mm,
as if, I use this metaphor of climbing a mountain, right? Like you climb, you climb, you climb, and you get to the very top, and you look up, and you think you've reached the summit, but you at base camp of yet another mountain to climb, right? And I think that my life is constantly one big fight, right? And it's a fight because I'm swimming in uncharted waters.
mm,
I'm deeply cognizant of the fact that wherever I go, I am almost always the only person like me in the room, right? To this
right.
day. And I feel like I'm constantly having to prove myself, to prove my worth, to prove my um that I'm worthy of being in the room, right? That I've got value,
Mm,
right? And it doesn't matter how much I've accomplished, right? In some ways I feel that my success has not been able to inoculate me against the continuation of like feeling lonely and isolated and
sure.
misunderstood and not validated, right? So it's a constant push and pull always.
Well, I appreciate your honesty and just willing to go there. Um you wrote or said something that I stumbled upon, which where you talked about just diversity and inclusion, and that uh, you sort of have all the ways to be diverse that's humanly possible in many ways, right? And you just talked about, I believe, even from your, your race, your sexual orientation, your disability, that it makes me obviously for those of us that care a lot about those issues, but I'm a cis white old white dude. Like here I am, but I want to be an advocate. I want to be helpful, and then you're such an inspiration to folks like me. I wonder what when did it sort of switch from you? I mean, we had the story of you fighting for yourself here to get into this school.
Mm.
Was there a moment when you began to maybe realize that you carry a burden to represent other folks or to lift other folks up? I know that you do that now. So when in your life did you start to maybe, for lack of a better phrase, become a little more outward focused and thinking about other folks that you could help?
I think it's been a slow progression, right? Like I think it's been cumulative, right? So I think there've been many little moments that have where I feel as though I am non-consensually a representative
Yeah.
of all of the communities that I embody, right? And represent. And there are days when I wish I could just show up as an individual, as just Eddie Ndopu, without having to be a spokesperson. I do wish that, but I realize that I have the enormous privilege, I think, of being able to use my voice to amplify voices that have been silenced for so long and overlooked.
Yeah.
And so now I recognize it as a privilege as opposed to a burden. But I think what the reframe that I've had to make is I my life in some ways belongs to the world,
Hmm.
right? And it's a strange thing to admit, and I think for many people whose purpose is high impact and whose purpose is to affect as many lives as possible, I think people can resonate with that, for whom for whom they also also have such a purpose. Like your life is not fully your own at
Yeah.
that point, and there's an acceptance that needs to happen there. And I'd say, each time I break down another barrier, whether it is going to the African Leadership Academy or later graduating from Oxford or being in the room with heads of state at the United Nations, wherever I find myself, it, I, I just have made peace with the fact that my life is not entirely my own, right? That there's a part of it that just is tethered to the world, uh, and I've just had to kind of make peace with that.
The when you said non-consensual and kind of
Mm,
chuckled a little, at first I wasn't sure if you were saying that, but I understand now. You're saying that you didn't necessarily ask for it,
right.
right? It's just when you come into a room, that's what
Mm,
happens.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
so there's is it fair to say maybe there's pressure of maybe I almost want to say that you have to be stronger than you want to be all the time, but I wonder if it's just a
Mm,
pressure of people want you to be. You know what I mean? Like those around you want you to be a motivation, which you are, but that can snowball into you probably have days where you don't want to be a motivation. You're like, just
yeah,
let me be here for a second.
there are, and I sometimes feel as though strength is a little bit overrated. Like again, it's one of those things. I don't have the choice not to be strong, right? Like I have to be. And sometimes I just wish that we'd graduate from this idea that there are certain individuals who carry the burden of having to be strong all the time, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm kind of like, can we advocate for softness and
Yeah.
tenderness
Yeah.
and moments where we kind of break down and where we're not okay and where we need support and where we need help? And in so many ways, Joe, I think that the pivot that I'm making right now in my life is that I've become a little bit of an anti-grit advocate. I think
Okay.
that
Yeah.
grit is essential, grit is important, but I think grit places all of the onus on the individual, right?
Mm.
And I'm just realizing the limits of grit, right? Like I used to buy into it 100%, right? Like I myself, I would participate in my own mythology, right? As this resilient, like super crip, right? This like extraordinary, like unicorn, right? Who's all of these identities, all of these experiences, and just this, singular character who's always transcendent. And I realized that there's a harm there. There is a harm that happens, because much of that is also, I think, a trauma response, right? That, if I'm perfect, then I might be more lovable. I might be more likable.
Mm.
If I'm, uber successful and uber accomplished, I can use that as a shield to deflect attention away from all of the ways in which I still feel pain and I still feel like an outlier a little bit. So I'm hoping that we could have a conversation about resilience that is honest and that's nuanced and that also leaves space and room for complexity and messiness, right? And I think that that's, if we can get there, then I think we are one step closer to fully humanizing folks who experience dehumanization constantly.
You're a very wise person.
Oh,
That's what I'm picking up from this. Uh, the way you explain things are just subtly different than the way I think about them. Really helps me understand better. So thank you for that. I know. We don't. Unfortunately, we don't have time to actually talk about all these accomplishments we've been talking about in general. But you're an accomplished person, and the you didn't ask for all of it, but you are a leader
mhm.
and an influencer. This podcast goes out to leaders all around the world and folks that I just think about people driving in their car to their commute. They're going to work. They're listening to your story. They're going to lead 3 or 5 or 15 people today.
Mhm.
Um, from your general lived experience, what um, maybe as we think about just what we've been talking about a little in terms of even diversity of thought or people's lived experiences coming from diverse backgrounds. Um, as leaders kind of walk into a room with the folks they're leading, is there anything kind of burning in you that you just wish you could tell the world about leadership or about the responsibility of leadership or how to think about folks as we lead them?
Yeah, and it's been said before, and I can't help but invoking this quote every time that, leadership is too important to be left up to leaders.
Hmm.
And I think that's a cheeky way of sort of reminding us that rank and leadership is not the same thing, right? That we often conflate the title, the position with leadership. And I think that the moment that we're living in now, which feels so incredibly tumultuous and just tough for all of us on a day-to-day basis, whether it's in our communities or it's the state of, the world, geopolitics. I think we are being invited to step into leadership, and I think those of us who do have the rank and the title, I think it is incumbent upon us to really ask ourselves constantly, daily, whether we are truly practicing leadership, beyond beyond rank, right? Like really
Yeah.
ensuring we're able to see people, validate people, and lead through crises, right? And so I think that's the burn, right? That's the yearning, is to be able to get leaders to think about leadership with the small L, right? And not the big
Yeah.
L. Like I think the
Yeah.
small L leadership is where true transformation is able to happen.
One of a similar thing I like to think of is one of the most simplest definitions of leadership is someone who other people are following,
Yeah,
which is kind of right there in what a leader, but
it's right there.
plenty of people have the title and nobody's actually following them, right?
Right,
And then
right,
there's folks that don't have the title that are actually the influencers often of the
right.
group. Those are the leaders.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if we turn our gaze to that and focus on that, then I just think so much more impact and change can happen
Yeah.
when when we just sort of shine a spotlight on where the true leadership happens.
We're getting ready to wrap up. I know before we here as we end, I want you to talk about your memoir and other ways people can find you. But one of the reasons I was excited to have you talk at the event is I think a lot of us have done. I'll just speak for myself. I've done uh, not enough, but some self reflection and some work in my own life over the last 5 to 10 years around diversity and inclusion, realizing some of my privileges and trying to react uh, with empathy and in the best way possible to use whatever I have to create a more diverse world.
Mhm,
Um, and I will confess that I probably tend to typically think of race
mhm,
and socioeconomic issues when I think of diversity.
mhm.
Uh, until you came into my life, I knew disabled folks were part of diversity, but I don't. It wasn't in that category in my mind for whatever reason. Just being honest. So thank you for teaching me that first of all, but also could you just speak to that before we run out of time about how diversity is more than just say about race or class?
Yeah, absolutely. I think diversity really is about the full texture and scope of the human condition, of what it means to be human, right? And there's so many ways in which we are more than just one thing, right? Like we embody a multiplicity of identities and experiences at the same time, right? So um and so disability is so critical. We can't
Mm.
leave people with disabilities out, and I think what I will say too is that if we implicate ourselves, right? So I often, and we probably need like another podcast for this, but I I often say that, if we're gonna address disability inclusion, then we need to talk about the elephant in the room, which is ableism, right?
Mm.
And ableism implicates all of us. It doesn't just dehumanize people with disabilities, it strips non-disabled people of their own humanity, right? Because ableism is about a very narrow definition of what it means to be beautiful, to be productive, to be
Mm.
valuable. And that harms all of us, right? Like there's
Yeah.
no way that we can all squeeze ourselves into one very narrow way of being. And so I think to take diversity issues seriously is really to think deeply about power. It's to think deeply about whose voice is heard, whose voice isn't, and constantly asking ourselves who's not in the room. And I think that opens up the aperture, or broadens it out a little bit, to include different experiences that we've never even considered or fathomed before.
Well, thank you for being in my virtual room today. I very much enjoyed our talk and have so much more to learn from you. And I'm so glad you're part of LeaderCast and part of our platform. I will say, on a personal note, your accomplishments are noteworthy, and maybe I wouldn't have found you without them. But having had several conversations with you now, it really is, Eddie. It really is your heart that draws me and so many folks, I think, to you, and your honesty and your authenticity. So thank you so much for being that sort of person, and not just an accomplished one.
Thank you for that. That's one of the nicest things anybody has ever said. So I appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. But before then, we got some books to push here. I'm just kidding.
Yes.
You would have done this no matter what, but you have a memoir coming out. I'm going to get it, but tell folks about it and how they can get it.
Sure. My memoir, Sipping Dom Perignon Through a Straw, is coming out August 1st. And it really, it's a memoir and it's focused on my time at Oxford. And it really is about the tension between success and difference, accomplishment and disability, and figuring out a way to reconcile those. So
I'll make sure to get that, and we'll make a note to our folks here that listen how to get it when it comes out. Anything else? Any other ways people could get in touch with you or learn more about you?
Yes, follow me across social media. I'm everywhere: LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Please, follow me and reach out. I'm always delighted to connect with people. I'm not hard to find.
Okay. All right, Eddie. Thank you. Thank you so much for being a part of LeaderCast in this podcast. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Joe.